And hello, welcome everyone to this video. In the last video, we actually talked about, we actually demonstrated that we have a in-memory database, okay, or in-memory object which stores all the data, which we can add components to, we can delete components, we can populate with some random junk data, we can clear all. All of this is done using a scope service which manipulates a singleton object, which is of course an object list of some sort. Okay, so the singleton will live throughout the lifetime of this website, and then we had the scope service to manipulate this singleton object. Okay, so where do we want to go from here? Okay, we don't just want to have data storage using RAM, we want to have data storage using a more powerful thing called databases, which is like MariaDb right here. Of course, Microsoft uses its own SQL database, and then a slightly more open source version, or the open source version is called MySQL, but the most open source version of MySQL is MariaDB. Okay, so that's why I like Linux and stuff, so I prefer working with open source so that I don't have to pay money, and I can modify the code as and how I like, or use it as and how I like. This is MariaDB. So I have a few videos of how to install MariaDB in the databases. I will include them in the video description, or even better, I may or may not, even better, you can actually just go to the playlist. Okay, most if not all my videos in the Playing with .NET Core series, at least the later ones, when you scroll all the way to the bottom, you will be able to see the playlist here, which is the playlist of the ASP.NET Core Playing with .NET Core video series, as well as the GitHub repository where I store my code. Okay, .NET Core YouTube. Okay, the experimental branch and the main branch. So I'll just close that. Make sure you know where to find those. So you need to know how to do a little bit of databases and MariaDB and how to install it. Okay, the installation instructions will be in this video number 28, how to install MariaDB, how to navigate around. So I assume you've already installed somehow, either in Linux, Mac or Windows. So I will just start up the MariaDB server or MariaDB client, and you'll be able to see here. Okay, and I can do show databases. This is not very case sensitive, but okay, show databases. We have a few test databases, and the one I'm using for this is the ASP MariaDB test. So this is the one I used it for. This is the one I used it for this .NET Core experimental server. Okay, so I have a few databases. The ASP MariaDB test was for the experimental database. Chemical engineering database was the one I was playing around. Okay, but I won't bore you with too many details. Okay, so assume you know a little bit of MariaDB database. There's some good news and bad news. Okay, the good news is you will not need to really make a lot of you will not ever need to really interact with this MariaDB interface so much. Okay, you can of course use it to check your tables. For example, select stuff from order history, and then we will be able to see all the data over here in the order history file. So that is some basic stuff. You might want to create your own users, but other than that, you don't really need to deal so much with MariaDB. Okay, the bad news is you need to learn some other code. Okay, which is again good and bad news, because in ASP.NET Core, the developers have already made a way for us to use C# class to interact with the MariaDB or SQL Server. Okay, this class is known as DbContext, and it's a family of objects. Okay, it's a family of objects inside this DbContext. So DbContext is a bit like the scope service that we had before. Okay, it's a little bit like the scope service we had before, in the sense that the whole purpose of it is to do to manipulate the underlying database. So over here, well, we use RAM to store our component list, and then we have a service called this component repository RAM. So this thing is like, okay, DbContext, you will kind of shove it into the component repository, and this DbContext object will actually instead of interacting with this singleton object which stores all your data, it will insert and delete rows from MariaDb. Okay, so yeah, let's do it using graphical, maybe a bit easier to understand, because there are a lot of classes here you will have to deal with. It can get very confusing. If you look at how many tabs I have open here, you can get an idea of how complex it is to use DbContext and understand what's going on under the hood. Okay, can be very confusing. Then I have a second list of tabs here, and most of the tabs I've closed already, but I think I've opened more than 30 tabs just to find out how this thing works. Okay, including looking at the source code. Okay, so let's give you a little bit of an overview of what's going on here. So instead of you having to type in the MariaDb queries in this command line, okay, DbContext database context already has the code for you. Okay, database context. Okay, it has the code for you to interact with MariaDB. Of course, provided that you install this, you have to install a plugin, because DbContext is designed by Microsoft. It's meant to use Microsoft SQL Server. So to interact with MariaDB, you need to use this Pomelo EntityFrameworkCore add-on. Okay, thankfully it's open source. You can actually look at what goes on under the hood, but there's a lot of code. Okay, it's a little bit hard to go through all of it. Okay, so yeah, you need to install all of this first, but before we go into installing, let's just give you an idea of what's going on. Okay, so we have DbContext, and then we have the MariaDB database. Okay, the MariaDB database is like right here. Okay, ASP MariaDB test. Okay, we are able to interact with this database using a command line interface, or else known as CLI. Okay, this command line interface, this command line interface for MariaDB is able to access this database and change the entries in it, create new entries, delete tables, drop tables, do whatever. Okay, unfortunately, of course, you will not be able to use this command line in our C# project or anything, but DbContext will help us to interact with the database. Okay, so how does the DbContext know how to interact with the correct MariaDB database? Okay, you need to provide information, right? What kind of information? You need to provide, let's say, a username. Okay, a username. Okay, and the user will usually be at some IP address. Okay, the username will be at some IP address. So I don't know how to put I'm not going to put my at properly, but this user will be at some IP address, and pardon the handwriting and all. Yeah, this username will be at some IP address. You need to provide some kind of password. Okay, you will need to provide a port number. Okay, all of this information you will need to store inside your MariaDB server. Okay, so so you will need to find out all of these things first. You may want to use a custom user with a custom password on the correct IP address. All of these settings you will need to connect to the MariaDB server. Now, where is all this data stored for DbContext? Right, DbContext will need to know all of these things in order to connect to the MariaDB server. So what actually happens? Okay, you actually need to store all this data inside another object called DbContextOptions. Okay, the DbContextOptions class, okay, or DbContextOptions object, which is instantiated by this DbContextOption class, will actually take the user, the login credentials that you need to access the server, the port number, all of this data will be shoved into this DbContextOptions. Okay, you'll see the more technical thing later on. Okay, and yeah, building a DbContextOptions class or object is not trivial itself. So what somehow the Microsoft developers they did is to have a DbContextOptions Builder. Okay, so this class is here to help us build this DbContextOptions. And once this DbContextOptions is built, okay, that means to say it's properly configured, you can then shove this into the DbContext class. And once this DbContext class is properly configured with the correct DbContextOptions, you can then use it to connect to MariaDb. So I say again, okay, what's happening, what's going on here? How is C# going to interact with the database? So C# interacts with the database via a plugin known as the DbContext class. It will be in its own namespace called Microsoft EntityFrameworkCore. You need to install this as an add-on. Okay, it doesn't come naturally with the Razor page or Microsoft MVC whatever. So this thing does not come as a what do you call that? It doesn't come as a pre-installed. So you have to kind of configure it yourself. So assuming you have configured it and the correct namespace is there that you can access this class, right? You will need to shove this object will need to know how to connect to the database, and all this database connection data right here will be moved into this DbContextOptions right here. And this DbContextOptions will then be so-called dependency injected into this. Well, not exactly injected, but it might as well be. I don't know. Yeah, it will be fed into this DbContext class. Okay. And then this DbContext class will then interact with your database. Okay. So in MariaDb, we know that under each database we have to create tables, right? We have to create tables. Okay, so for example, I have a table here which is based on my experimental database. There's customer, there's burger cost, sites cost, drink cost, blah blah blah, right? You have to make a table kind of manually. You have to sort of decide what each column has, and then decide the contents of the columns. Okay, so how does so yeah, normally in MariaDB we have to go and key in some MySQL query or MariaDB query in order to make this table, and then to view the table we use select star from whatever table, right? As long as we are in the correct database. So how is it being done here? Okay, conventionally, okay, you would if you look at our current way of doing data, we store our data within a list. Okay, we store our data within a list, and then this list is being interacted with using a repository class. Okay, whereas for here, in MariaDB, I mean in the DbContext class, okay, we usually append to it. That means we add to this a special kind of list. Okay, or the proper thing is called enumerable. Okay, this thing is sort of analogous to the list that we have. Okay, this is an in-memory list that we need to append to this DbContext. Okay, this is sort of a list, but it's not the list in the same way that we deal with in the RAM version of data storage. But this is a temporary list, okay, which is made in C#. Okay, you make this so-called database set object, which is sort of a list, but it's not really a list. You make it in C# so that in this list, when you fill it with objects like strings, integers, or some other kind of objects, for example, our component objects, you will have a DbSet of those component objects, and then what happens? The object, the DbSet object will be also fed into the database context. Or maybe not fed, but what people normally do is that they take these two together, the database set, the DbSet list, and the database context object. What do? They create a they put these two classes or these two objects, and they kind of make it inherit. Alright, what people do is they make a new class, sometimes called AppDbContext. Okay, AppDbContext. This AppDbContext will inherit all its functions, methods, properties from DbContext, and then we add this DbSet database set list as another property to this AppDbContext. And this AppDbContext will then know, from the way we make the database set, DbSet, it will know how to create the right kind of table that you want in the MariaDb database. Okay, so this is an idea, hopefully, to give you an idea what's going on when we sift through the code. And if you don't get it the first time, I'll keep repeating this concept in different ways until you get it, because it's a lot of information, okay, to know how MariaDB works. So I might go through the code a little bit more in the coming videos, and then I show you how to install, walk you through everything. Again, don't expect, I'm not a professional, I'm not a computer scientist, but I've at least used it once before, and I'm sharing my learning online for my own memory. And well, if you want to see it, you are free to. Okay, so I'll see you guys in the next video where we will go through, we will try to break down how all these classes actually come together, right? So that you know what's going on. Okay, because if you take a look online, how we supposed to use MariaDB server, you will just see a lot of code here. For example, this you will see services, DbContext pool, MariaDB context options. Go to options, use MySQL configuration, get configuration string. Okay, and then you'll see this MySQL options also being done. There is some server version here, and the server type MariaDB. Okay, you look at this line of code, you will not have any idea what is going on at all, because unless you've used it so many times before, you've looked at the source code. Otherwise, as a first timer, you look at this, you can get very intimidated. Okay, so I'm trying not to intimidate, but let's break down the DbContext, DbSet, all of this, so that we know what's going on. Okay, I talked enough. Thanks for watching. I will see you next time. Hopefully we'll go through these bits of code one at a time. Alright, see ya.